This panel will throw out some of the big issues in China's next 20 years of reform and development. This is a good time to be thinking about the next 20 years. What's happened in the last 31 and a bit years since Deng Xiaoping got the numbers in the Central Committee to end a couple of years of incoherent policy and to embark upon the period of reform and opening up the economy has been consistent development which, at least in retrospect, was in a clear direction and with some fairly continuous structural developments in the economy. One of those, which really got underway in the mid-80s, was the development of export-oriented industrialization based on an abundance of labour, low wages, competitiveness in simple labour-intensive manufactures. Well, that was a very successful base for Chinese development. But in a period around now, the structure of that growth has to change, so it's a good time to be thinking about the reforms that will be necessary to keep things going in future. This is also a time when we're all thinking about the big structural change in China's place in the world, and we're all aware, and we've discussed at these updates over the last decade, the tectonic shift in world economic weight and power from the established developed countries to the large developing countries, but first of all China, not only China, but first of all China. All of that's been accelerated in the wake of the global financial crisis. The big developed economies of North America and Europe did themselves great damage with the global financial crisis, a self-inflicted wound, but a deep one that has set each of those economies on a lower growth path with continuing troubles into the foreseeable future. But those great events of 2008 and early 2009 haven't much affected the growth trajectory of the big developing countries. China, in fact, as the ambassador pointed out at our launch of the book last night, China, in making sure that its own growth was unaffected by the global financial crisis with the very big fiscal and monetary expansion, made the most important contribution it could make to world economic recovery. But not only in China, in India, the crisis has underlined how well established the accelerated growth since the openings of the early 90s really is, and the much improved performance of the third and fourth biggest of the developing countries, Indonesia and Brazil, has been confirmed by this recent experience. So this is a time when we have to be thinking about an acceleration of the big tectonic shifts with China at their centre. So I think it's a propitious time to be analysing the next 20 years of China's reform and economic growth. We've got a very good panel of 5 people to start off the discussion. I'll only very briefly introduce them one by one, most very well known to this group. First, Jane Golley from the Crawford School. Jane has joined Ligang and I in building the base for this annual event, and we very much welcome Jane. You're joining us in that leadership capacity. Jane's own work on China is well known from earlier updates with deep knowledge of the regional dimension of Chinese development extending into broader macroeconomic things. And so we look forward, Jane, to your current views on the next 20 years in China.
Thanks, Ross, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing this year's China Update book as my first time as one of the co-editors. And I guess I'd first of all like to thank all of the authors for their hard work and valuable contributions to what I hope you'll all agree is an excellent book, if I can say so myself. I've got about 10 minutes, possibly 12, I hope. Not all of the authors will be speaking today, some of them will, but I want in this 10 minutes or so to talk about, to give you a flavour of the book really, to bring up the key themes covered in the 17 chapters and also to mention the 24 authors who have contributed to the book this year. It's difficult to try and project forwards by looking backwards, and yet that's what economists often try to do. I have an old friend who I took my Bachelor of Economics with, who once thought that he knew a road that he was driving along well enough that he could judge the turn ahead by looking into the rear vision mirror. He misjudged it and he drove into a tree. It was fortunate that he was only going 50 kilometres an hour, but it was rather unfortunate that he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He lived, but he now has a steel plate that holds his then shattered skull together. And I think perhaps even more sadly than that, he left economics and became a biostatistician. There are many morals to this story, and one of them is don't speed, watch out for bends in the road, and wear a seatbelt, especially if you're an economist. But this might be another way of saying that we should be prepared for our predictions, or for some of our predictions at least, to turn out to be wrong in the future. Perhaps that story sprung to mind for me because of Wing Tai Wu's entertaining chapter in this year's book, in which he depicts the Chinese economy as a speeding car. Wing will have more to say in this session about the potential hazards that China may face along what he calls the rocky road to prosperity. Certainly it is clear that if China is going to continue along its remarkable path in the next 2 decades, it will need to steer skillfully through a number of key challenges. One of those key challenges facing China in the decades ahead is how to steer through the turning point, or more accurately, the turning period in economic development. Ross Garnaut and other authors Sai Feng and Meiyan Wang argue that China has decisively entered this period already, which is characterised by the end of the labour surplus economy and rising wages in some, although not all, sectors of the economy. Garnaut focuses on the big picture implications of this period, such as the need for changes in the industrial structure and the composition of trade, as China loses its comparative advantage in the labour-intensive goods that have been such an engine of growth for it in the past. Sai and Wang, on the other hand, focus on the plight of farmers turned migrant workers and how further labour market reforms, with the hukou system in particular, can transform these into migrants turned urban residents in the decades ahead. As always, there's plenty of room for debate among the China Update authors. We're not presenting a consensus view. With the tightening of the labour market, as these authors suggest, one might expect that during economic downturns, some workers, and rural migrant workers in particular, would suffer either in terms of employment or wage reductions. Yet Sherry Tao Kong, Xin Meng and Dan Zhang find that during the GFC period, there were almost no wage reductions for migrants in cities. They have very detailed urban-rural migration data, and this provides a contrary view to the idea that China's labour surplus is about to be exhausted. I think this is a critical debate with far-reaching implications for the future prosperity of the Chinese economy and its future, and we will certainly be hearing more about that today. The challenge of rebalancing growth looms large in this year's book from a variety of angles. One feature of China's unbalanced growth in the past has been its heavy reliance on resource and energy-intensive production. Hugh Mackay, Ligang Song and Yongsheng discuss in their chapter in a session later today that this imbalance won't be rectified overnight. Indeed, they predict that the per capita steel demand in China will continue to rise through to 2020 at least. The ongoing strength of Chinese demand for many resources and energy products will continue to place pressure on these global markets, and the Chinese will need to respond to these pressures. This challenge is clearly linked to the imperative of moving towards a low-carbon growth economy and of finding effective ways to deal with the dire consequences that China's growth has had on the global and local environments. In his chapter, Zhang reflects on what it will take for China to achieve its environmental objectives, and both he and Hugh Mackay will talk more about that in a session later on. Another feature of China's unbalanced growth in the past has been the reliance on exports and investments, and it's well known that this has contributed to the rise in global imbalances, but also to many structural problems within China as well. There is now quite a widespread recognition of the need to rebalance growth towards domestic consumption and productivity. Entering the turning period will address this naturally to some extent, as higher wages give rise to higher consumption. But much more remains to be done. Yiping Huang and Beijing Wang offer a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, factor market reform. They argue that while China's gradual and piecemeal approach to economic reforms has been beneficial in the past, it will threaten the stability, the balance and the sustainability of growth in the future unless factor market reforms are completed, something that will take decades in some areas. Raising productivity is a crucial component of this rebalancing issue, and for Yenrui Wu, indigenous innovation holds the key. Wu shows that despite a rapid expansion in innovation outcomes in recent years, there is still a significant gap, as we'd expect, between China and the world's leading innovators, and also indications that a growth in the quantity has come at the expense of quality. Interestingly, he shows that state-owned enterprises in China have outperformed the foreign invested and Chinese firms when it comes to research and development outcomes. And this calls for specific policies to ensure that privatisation and further ownership reforms do not come at the expense of innovation in the future. On global imbalances, the chapters by Xiaogang and Rod Thye and Yin Zhang contribute to the ongoing debate regarding the renminbi. I think both of these chapters demonstrate the importance of understanding the peculiarities of the Chinese economy when entering into one of the world's hottest debates. China's rise to become one of the most dynamic and globally integrated market economies has fundamentally changed the global economic landscape. And while this clearly presents challenges the world over, I think one message is clear, and that's that we're all in this together. And that's not all bad news. According to Chunlai Chen, the China effect of FDI on 12 other developing Asian economies during the last 20 years has been positive, and he predicts that these positive linkages will strengthen in the next 20 years. With the ageing and increasing wealth of the Chinese population, not only will other Asian economies become more attractive alternative destinations for the location of labour-intensive manufacturing, but they're also likely to be the destinations of choice for Chinese outward FDI, and that's becoming increasingly large and significant. In their chapter, or in the next chapter, Premachandra Athakarala and Arachanun Kopaboon dispel the decoupling thesis, which posits that the East Asian region has essentially become able to maintain dynamism regardless of what's going on in the industrialised world. Instead, they find that the rising importance of global production sharing has in fact strengthened the linkages between East Asia and the rest of the global economy. They call for an integrated East Asian policy response to the patchy global recovery that emphasises rebalancing growth away from exports and towards domestic markets, where we've already seen that China is intent on doing just the same. But they also caution against using this enthusiasm for rebalancing growth as a vehicle for trade protectionism, and instead make a strong case for multilateral and unilateral trade liberalisation, not only in East Asia but the world over. Returning to domestic imbalances, sharing the benefits of growth is not just an economic issue, but also an ethical one, particularly for a regime whose legitimacy has long been based on egalitarian principles, best summed up by serving the people. In my own chapter, I look at just one of the many types of inequalities that dominates China's economic landscape, and that is regional disparities in industrial development. By 2050, it's a while away, but the current leadership has set itself the very formidable goal of considerably reducing the disparities that exist between West China and the rest of the country. And industrial relocation westward is one of the key mechanisms through which this goal can be achieved. Again, the turning period will create some natural forces to help in the achievement of this goal, but I argue that it's likely to translate into no more than a minimal reduction in regional disparities in the next 2 decades, although our Foreign Minister's comments on his efforts out west may prove me wrong. Another aspect of the domestic economy that is in need of rebalancing is the healthcare system, and Ryan Manuel shows that this has become increasingly inequitable, costly and ineffective over time, which is not what we want to hear about a prosperous China or any other country. Despite the recent injection of public funds into the system, Manuel argues that the Chinese healthcare system will continue to face troubles unless the Chinese government can address the flawed incentives facing the health service providers and also the lack of coordination and governance in the system. Uneven access to healthcare, along with the rising income inequalities, inadequate social welfare systems, and also the slowdown in poverty alleviation in recent times are some of the most undesirable outcomes of China's rapid growth in the past, and they may pose serious threats to social stability in the future. Now, intricately linked into all of the economic challenges outlined above is the question of political reform. Yang Yao will speak in this session about China's future development model, which he says will require explicit political reform and ideally democratisation to counterbalance the formation of strong interest groups which have increasingly contradictory goals beyond that of economic growth alone. Yongsheng Zhang argues that sees democratisation as part of the solution for establishing effective intergovernmental relationships in China, as he too is about to discuss. For both Yao and Zhang, political reform is key to China's long-term prosperity. Yet, like so much of China's reform and development process, it is likely to be gradual and certainly not without Chinese characteristics. The next 2 decades are likely to be more challenging than the past as China embraces a new mode of economic growth driven not only by efficiency but also by sustainability and equity considerations. I think this is the overarching challenge for China in the decades ahead, to successfully shift into this new mode of growth. But that won't be possible unless China completes the overarching task that remains unfinished, that of completing the transition to a true market economy by further reforming the country's factor markets and carrying out more comprehensive institutional reforms in the economic system, in government, in its legal system and also in the political system as well. If successful, the next 2 decades is likely to see China elevated to a position of global primacy, or at least co-primacy, alongside the United States. But this success isn't guaranteed, and it will require many changes from the status quo, as I think the chapters in the book identify. To borrow from Wing's analogy in closing, I would like to say that if China has been a speeding car, then it's done a fantastic job so far. The Chinese leadership could be likened to a Formula One pro. But for the future, it may be time to slow down just a little bit. More importantly, it is surely time for all of the players in the Chinese economy to start wearing seatbelts. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane, for that engaging overview of the contents of the update book this year. I think the seatbelts are for us all to wear, not just Chinese, because we'll all feel any bumps from now on with China's international integration. We now move on to Yang Yao. Yang's been a close colleague of ours since he first went back to China, to the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University after a PhD and teaching roles in the United States. I think your first big project might have been our work together on the private sector in China, and Yang's work's impressive for its breadth and creativity in many fields that are important to development in China but aren't in the center of economists' traditional concerns. And he brings to analysis of political economy dimensions of China's development the rigor of an economist. Yang.
Okay, it's always a great pleasure to come to ANU to meet all the friends, and this I remember this is my third time to come to China Update, and this year's topic is all very interesting. Jen just set the stage. I'm going to talk, not my chapter straightforward, but it's some of my recent thoughts about the investment-driven nature of the Chinese economy and how it's going to be sustainable. Now, looking at this figure, you're going to want how the Chinese economy has been growing in the last several decades. Basically, it's an investment-driven growth. And especially if you can see that that's the red line. So investment rate has been kept at about 45% of GDP. So if you look at our overall savings rate, in recent years it has been more than 50%. So we saved more than 50% of GDP. And look at the consumption side. The ratio of consumption in GDP declined from like 67% in the early 90s to now only 48% of GDP. Right. So that's the overall growth pattern of the Chinese economy. And I want to ask a question whether this investment-driven model is sustainable in the next 20 years. I want to put my emphasis on the role of the government. In particular, look at this figure. This is capital formation in government expenditure. You can see that the Chinese government as a whole, central government and the local governments as a whole, invest about 30 to 50% of its revenue. Okay, that's a lot. Government revenue accounts for about 24% of GDP. That's very large by a developing country standard. And among that, 30 to 50% has been invested. People always say Chinese people love to save. But if you look at household saving in disposable income is about 35%, only 35%. So in that case, our government loves saving more than ordinary people. Of course, our enterprises save 90% of its retained revenues. Right. So that's a figure. Right. Then we have to ask where this huge savings come from. I would like to say this is mostly because of our demographic transition. Now we are at the highest point of demographic dividends, mirrored by the ratio of working population on dependent population. So this blue line is East Asia, but East Asia is mainly China. Chinese population is 90% of East Asian population. So this year and the year, several years after this year will be the highest point of demographic dividends. The working to non-working ratio is about 2.5. Right? So 2.5 working persons are responsible to one non-working person in China. So that's very high. And then, of course, we are going to experience a faster decline. But we are not going to deplete our demographic dividends until 2025. Right? Of course, if you look at this figure, you can see China has kind of a condensed demographic transition than most other countries. Right? So that's why we save a lot. And the period of this high saving will be very short. Now, then the question is whether those savings are used in the most efficient way, or whether the investment has been used in the most efficient way. Right? Here, I guess if you have been to China, especially to Shanghai, you'll recognize this. This is the magnetic train line linking Pudong, downtown Pudong, and the Pudong International Airport. It's only 35 kilometers long, but it cost 10 billion RMB to build it. It's actually just a big toy. It's losing money every day. But the government, curiously enough, is going to extend this magnetic train line to Hangzhou, a nearby city, to 220 kilometers away. But in the meantime, there is a high-speed, conventional high-speed train line being built now, and it's going to operate next year. And how faster this magnetic train is going to be than the conventional high-speed train? 5 minutes. Okay. So is it going to make money? No one's going to believe it's going to make money, right? Are you going to pay 50% more to have 5 minutes earlier to reach Shanghai from Hangzhou? I don't think so. Right. The government has a lot of money. This year, the government is going to have 8 trillion RMB in hand, and then if we include the money from selling land, it's going to be at least 10 trillion. So that's a huge amount of money, and the government mostly wants to invest. But the investment is not that good in China, especially in today's China, because there's external and internal imbalances, and government investment actually is distorting the Chinese economy to magnify the imbalance instead of to correct it. Right. Here I want to draw on my recent study with a co-author on infrastructure investment done by provincial governments in the last 30 years. I mean, in most countries, infrastructure investment is a virtue, right? It's welcomed. And especially in India. One time, actually, I gave my paper in India, and most of my Indian colleagues say, hey, what's the problem with the infrastructure investment? One of the causes identified for India to lag behind China is because of lack of infrastructure. So you're talking about the infrastructure is bad. But I'd like to tell you that infrastructure investment actually is just too much in China. Because the scale is huge, right? You go to China, you just see the whole China just like a construction site, right? In China, infrastructure investment is a direct subsidy to capital, right? Because especially on the local government level, local governments invest hugely into land. The land is sold cheaply to investors, so that's a direct subsidy. And also, infrastructure investment to promote capital-intensive industries, because those industries use roads, other transport means most intensively. So, like if you make a car, then of course you use the transport a lot. But if you operate just a small shop, right, you don't use that much transport. Now, so then this is the data we got from the provinces for the last 30 years, and there is a clear negative correlation between infrastructure investment ratio in government expenditure and household consumption share in GDP. Right? That's very clear, because if you invest into infrastructure, you are going to promote those heavier sectors. In this case, the secondary sector. The secondary sector is heavier than the service sector. And if a province invests more into infrastructure, then that province is going to have a larger secondary industry. Right? So this is mechanism one. And if you have a larger secondary sector, you are going to have a small labor share in GDP. So basically, the secondary sector pays labor less than service sector or than agriculture. Right. Now, the second mechanism is returns to capital. If you invest more into infrastructure, you're going to have a higher profit ratio in industry for industry. And so this figure shows that. And if the industry is more profitable, then household consumption as a ratio of GDP drops, because there is a crowding out effect, and also because rich people do not consume that much. Especially in China, most of the returned profits have been reinvested. 90% or more than that have been reinvested. Okay. So that's one kind of a way to use China's huge savings, right? And I want to argue that's not the most efficient way to use our huge saving. An alternative way to use our saving is to invest in people. Okay, returns to education are increasing and not as high as developed countries. In developed countries, it's about 15% of your wage increase for one more year of education. In China, it's lower, but still more than 10%, and it's increasing. And also, investment in people has long-lasting effects. Right? Promote safe learning. If you invest in people, you don't need to increase investment into people. They're going to learn. They're going to pay for that. So no maintenance cost, right? And it also transmit to the next generation, especially if you invest into mothers, the children's education will be increased, okay? And also, especially, we have to invest in the right people. And those people shown here, I think this picture must be coming from Foxconn. I'm joking, but Foxconn actually employs 600,000 people in China. Right? That's a huge number of people. We have to invest in those people who really need education and who are going to be the major body of China's labor force currently and also in the next 10 to 20 years. So we have to invest more into those people to sustain China's economic growth in the next 20 years. Let's stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Zhang. Our next speaker, Andrew Watson. Andrew's been a very important part of our network of research on China back over 20 years. We learned a great deal from the collaboration between Andrew and Chris Finlay at Adelaide, and they participated in many of our projects in the early years of understanding big structural changes in China. Our contact with Andrew continued when he ran the Ford Foundation in China from Beijing, and your support then, for amongst other things, the update was very welcome, and now we're glad to have Andrew back in Australia, back in Adelaide.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ross, for that nice warm welcome. My topic today is I want to focus on the role and nature of China's social security system. And my starting point for thinking about this is working on an AusAid-funded project with the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security in China to develop social security for migrant workers. This very group that Yao Yang stresses are important for the next stage of transformation and change in China. As we all know, migrant workers have made a huge contribution to China's economic growth, to economic structural change, the emergence and growth of labor-intensive manufacturers. They make a huge contribution to the building of that infrastructure. A lot of those railways are actually built with migrant labor. They're building China's cities. So they've made this huge contribution. And they are going on making that contribution, over 220 million of them, more than the workforce of the US and possibly Europe. But the household registration system excludes them from the urban services and urban privileges. They bear all the risks as individuals. And I think the Chinese government has recognized this, particularly since the year 2006. There's the beginnings of an effort to develop social security for migrant workers. And the AusAid project is trying to help the Chinese government think about how to form public policy in this field. After all, Australia's got a lot of experience, compulsory superannuation since the early 90s. We've recently had the succession of Hamer, Henry, Cooper, various reports, all of which have a big focus on the issue of an aging population and the role of pensions and social security. So I think the problem facing China is that its social security system is relatively young. The urban system only began to develop since about 1994. And it's a fragmented system. The social safety nets are handled by one ministry, the social insurance system by another. It's fragmented by categories of people. Different categories of people in China get different access to the system, get different levels of treatment. And it's fragmented by different localities. China doesn't have one integrated social security system. It has over 2,000 local pools, and each pool is managed differently and has various different standards. And that, of course, means that transferring from one place to another is difficult. So as a result, China urgently needs to reform this system, urgently needs to think about investing in people. I agree. The development of social security is now a major policy goal of the Chinese government. It's what they call 重中之重, the most important of all the important. And in the next 5-year plan, there's going to be a lot of focus on this. And I think over the next 20 years, it's going to be a key issue for public policy and for economic policy. Now, in some ways, I'm an anomaly out here in this panel. I think I'm the only one with no chapter in the book. And I must say I feel to some extent that there's perhaps not enough focus on social security issues, social insurance issues in this book, given the role it's going to play over the next 20 years. And so perhaps inviting me to talk is a kind of belated recognition that the issue needs some consideration. I think there are several reasons why it's important to think about this, not only in terms of the individual, but in terms of the overall economic growth. First of all, the Chinese labor market is integrating. There are still barriers, but labor mobility is increasing. It's an inevitable trend of the reform process. But the social security system is static. It's tied to people. It's tied to household registration. It's tied to place. So labor is mobile. Social security is not mobile. And that inevitably raises a barrier to the future development of factor markets, to the future development of labor mobility. It could become a barrier to structural change. And so there's a very fundamental reason there for thinking about it. A lot of this volume focuses on rebalancing the Chinese economy, issues to do with income distribution, the very unequal income distribution in China, the Gini coefficient perhaps up to 0.5, about the relationship between consumption and savings and the different role of enterprise investment and household income. And of course, the development of a reliable, effective social security system has some implications for that. It has implications for individuals' savings and consumption behavior. It has some implications for trying to ameliorate the income inequalities. Yang also mentioned the demographic transition that's about to take place. China has an aging population. Already about 13% of the Chinese population is aged over 60. By 2020, it'll probably be around 17%. By 2040, it's going to be around about 30%. And while that happens, of course, the working population declines. When the migrant workers today who are contributing to economic growth retire, there's going to be fewer people around to support them in their old age. So unless the Chinese government starts working on this now, unless it pays attention to developing a social security system, it's going to face huge fiscal challenges, huge challenges for how to look after these people. Another issue, of course, is the role of social security funds in capital development, capital formation. China's social insurance system is contributory, like superannuation. So there are potentially large volumes of funds flowing into it. Currently, the urban insurance system has about 1.2 trillion yuan accumulated within it, already quite a big bag of money, even though it's divided among lots of pools. The new rural pension plan, just introduced experimentally at the beginning of this year, will grow over the next 10 or 15 years. Some people estimate that even at the lowest contribution rate, by 2020 it will have 5 trillion yuan in it. And that's only the beginning. These things are going to grow. So this is going to make huge demands on the financial system. Old age insurance is long-term, 50, 60 years of individual contributions and drawing pensions. It's not like the other insurances. It has an important financial role. It's going to put pressure on the need to preserve the value of funds, to grow the value of funds. So the financial system is going to have to respond. It's going to have governance implications, governance and transparency implications. Are the funds transparent, reliable, well managed? There are all kinds of demands at that level. Another factor is, of course, the political economy of the development of this system, because there are huge conflicts of interests in the development of these social security, social insurance systems. Employers don't want to hand out more for their employees' pensions. It raises their labor costs. Employees, of course, are keen to get that. Migrants especially, who are excluded. Urban locals want to protect their local pool, their local fund. They don't want migrant outsiders taking it away. Local government is ambivalent. On the one hand, local governments are not keen to have migrants join social insurance because it would increase costs of local manufacturing and therefore might make them less competitive in attracting investment. On the other hand, they're quite keen to have the migrant contributions because the migrants go away and then they keep that contribution in their local pool. Different branches of government are competing. Is it a tax issue? Should the tax office manage it? Is it a social security issue? The social security ministry should run it. And of course then there are central government, local government conflicts over the fiscal responsibilities of the system. So it's no surprise to me that the social insurance law, which has been under discussion for some time now, still is not coming out because there are all these conflicts of interest and some weighty economic debates. So I think for all these sorts of reasons, the social security, social insurance system has some very important implications for the way China is going to go over the next 20 years. It's going to be a key task for the government, big economic implications, and I certainly think it needs a chapter in the next volume of the China Update series. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And now we know that this authoritative work is being done. We've got someone to write a chapter, which we didn't know that we had when we started planning for this volume, but a crucial issue in the period ahead in China, with ramifications for many other things, including the rebalancing of the economy. Our next speaker is Yongsheng Zhang. Yongsheng from the Development Research Centre of the State Council, a very important and influential policy body in China. For the last few years, but especially over the last year, as climate change mitigation has become a central objective of Chinese policy. Yongsheng's been at the centre of that. We're not going to get a solution to the global problem of mitigation of climate change unless a set of ideas are developed that seems reasonable to China and to other countries, and Yongsheng's going to be one of the people whose work will determine whether or not the global community finds such a basis for action. Yongsheng.
Thanks, Ross, for your kind in-introduction. But I'm not going to talk about climate change. My chapter is intergovernmental, central-local government relationship in China. And I can't remember how many times I have been to Australian National University, but it's always my pleasure to be here. The central-local government relationship, when we look for the next 20 years of reform and development, the central-local relationship is an important issue we need to tackle. There is a dilemma when deal with the central-local relationship. If the central government were too strong, then it will have opportunistic behavior to the local government. If the local governments were too strong, then they will have opportunistic behavior to the central government. In either situation, the nation couldn't be sustainable and stable. So the power of the central and the local must be effectively balanced. There is a very interesting phenomenon in the world, including Australia. The central government controls most of fiscal resource of the nation, and the local governments have to financially rely on transfer payments from the central government. It's called vertical fiscal imbalance. While there is a vertical fiscal imbalance, there are many conventional explanations, such as to avoid the externalities and the spillover effects and so on. My explanation is that the reason why the central government needs to control most fiscal resources of the nation is to use the transfer payments as a hostage to influence the local governments. Because in a democratic country, the central government cannot control the appointment of the local officials, so it has to use the fiscal resources and transfer payments to be a hostage to influence the local governments. So in this situation, a balanced central-local government relationship can be established. Since China started its reform in 1978, it first adopted a fiscal system called Fiscal Federalism. The province had big fiscal autonomy. They controlled most of the fiscal resources of the nation, and the central government's revenue only accounted for about 30% of the total revenue. So it was very different from that of the Western countries. In 1994, the central government introduced the tax sharing system. Since ever, the central government started to control most fiscal resources of the nation, and the local governments have to financially heavily rely on the transfer payment from the central government. This is similar to that of the developed countries, but what is different is that in China, the central government also controls the appointment of major provincial officials. So in terms of central-local government relationship, China is like China's dynamic economy. The intergovernmental relationship is also in a very dynamic process. There are many positive changes that are reshaping and reestablishing China's central-local government relationship. For instance, the Chinese government has already officially endorsed the so-called socialist democracy, and the grassroots elections and internal democracy in the Communist Party are being widely practiced and developed, and the rule of law and civil society are being established. So as far as I can say, there are four major possible scenarios in the evolution of China's future central-local relationship. The first scenario is a continuation of the current central-local relationship, in which the central government control most fiscal resources and also control the appointment of the local government officials. The advantage of this structure is that the central government has very strong fiscal capability and authorities to effectively realize the so-called state will and push forward the national agenda on reform and development. But the problem is that this structure is not sustainable in long run, and the social cost and the pressure to remain in this structure is huge. As we can say that many current economic and social problems in China are a consequence of this structure, such as massive conflicts, petitions, farmer questions, huge local government deaths, and the distorted market and the corruption, as just Professor Yao mentioned. The second scenario is an example of good market economy like Australia and USA. In this scenario, the higher government control most fiscal resources of the nation, but cannot control the appointment of local officials since there is democracy. In addition, a good rule of law is also established. As far as we can say, this structure is probably the most stable and sustainable structure in the world. If China can evolve to this structure, depends on two conditions. First is the development of democracy, and second is the rule of law. Although the grassroots elections are developing steadily in China, they are still at a relatively early stage. To what level and when direct elections can develop in the future is still unclear. And also the government's power needs to be fully checked and balanced so the market can function well. As civil society and liberty grow with rapid economic growth, the rule of law and democracy will eventually be well established in China. The third scenario is the example of bad market economy. In this scenario, the fiscal and the personal dimensions are the same as that of the second scenario, but the difference is that there is no good rule of law. At present, vested interests instead of ideology have become the biggest impediments to China deepening its economic and political reforms. Since the interest group are very influential and the government is very powerful, some of the privileges have been institutionalized by law. So if this situation cannot be changed, China is likely to evolve to a bad market economy. This is a scenario China needs to try to avoid. The fourth scenario, as I can say, is a mixed structure. At the central provincial level, the central government controls most resources of the nation and the appointment of major provincial officials. But at the provincial local level, it's like Western countries. The provincial government controls fiscal resources, but cannot control the appointment of local officials because of the grassroots democracy. This structure is very likely to occur in China in the future. There are two first steps are needed to shift to this mixed structure. One is the grassroots democracy spreads to the county level from the township level and the village level. And another is that the fiscal relationship between provincial and local governments will also be institutionalized by the tax sharing system. This mixed structure implies that China might develop a unique vertical intergovernment arrangement deeply rooted in its 5,000-year history, tradition, culture, and vast population. This mixed structure also provides rooms for a central-provincial relationship to further evolve to the second scenario once conditions mature. This is also consistent with China's gradual reform approach. In its mixture structure, how to avoid vertical government opportunistic behavior remains a major challenge and is largely dependent on the rule of law and the top leaders' moral merit. So let's see what will happen in China in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yongsheng. Next we have Thye Wu. Wing's been associated with the ANU's work on Asia for a long time, and if there are two strengths greater than any others around here, it's the research on the Indonesian economy and on the Chinese economy, and it's been great to have Wing deeply involved in both over a couple of decades. Wing's now at the University of California, Davis, with a link to Brookings. He was based previously at Brookings, from where he was the person to establish the relationship of Brookings to our annual updates and to the volume. Thye Wu.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here again in Canberra. I think if we are to think of China in the last 30 years, one way to depict it, as Jane has said, is to think of China's 10% growth rate a year as like life in the passing lane of life. In the passing lane, you could think of where would China end up in 20 years. If a crash were to happen, we could classify the type of crashes into three categories. One is hardware failure, second, software failure, and the third is power supply failure. Hardware failure would be akin to the tire rolling off the car. This is an area in which economists specialize in. Think of the financial crisis that happened. So hardware failure generally refers to a failure in economic mechanism. For example, the government's budget being out of control. This is an area in which China has done very well in, because this is an area in which it is easiest to do something about, largely because all you have to really do is to open your eyes and see what other countries had done when such accidents happen. And in the case of China, it did exactly that. It decided to abandon central planning for a market economy, decided to reduce public ownership with private ownership, and on a whole slew of fronts. When you think about what to do when an export shock happened recently from the global financial crisis, China went on a big spending spree. This is exactly what Keynesian economics would have predicted. However, there are many areas that China needs to be more creative about, specifically, let us say, dealing with the area of trade imbalance. China always says, what else do you want us to buy? More iron, more steel, more airplanes? We're already up the world's single largest purchaser. The truth is, China can be more creative technically. For example, it could import a lot more. When it thinks of import, it thinks of merchandise. When one area in which it could import substantially is in the field of services, specifically investment in people. It is not just investment in hardware. One way that China could easily reduce the trade imbalance in the short run is to largely increase the amount of scholarships it gives to its students to go abroad to acquire human capital. So for hardware failure, China has been more creative. But in general, it's easy to solve because you open your eyes and look what the rest of the world has done. Software failure, that is akin to a car crashing because people inside the car are fighting over the direction that the car is going or the manner in which the car is being driven. But this is the area, I think, that the Chinese government sees to be its Achilles heel. Because in 2006, the government ended its annual party congress with a change in slogan. In the last 20 years, as always say, the biggest task in the coming year is economic construction. But this time it says, our biggest task is to build a harmonious society. To say that is an admission that conditions in China are not leading China towards a harmonious society. So here we have a seeming contradiction. On one hand, I would say that the administrative performance of the government has actually improved, thanks to computerization of records and thanks to the sending of its officials to elite schools like ANU to learn the art of better governance. There is no doubt that governance in China has improved. But yet, we see a growing number of social incidents every year in China. People participating in protest against what they see to be failures in governance. Specifically, we read about poisonous food, dangerous toys, tainted medicine and milk, and we hear about non-enforcement of safety regulations. So the issue is, how is it that I claim administrative performance is increasing, yet the number of people involved in social incidents has been exploding over time? I think this is largely a case of where people's expectations about the role of the government has increased faster than the improvement in governance. And this comes about because the general public in China is a more educated public, and it has traveled the world and seen governance elsewhere. And coming home, they expect more of their government than of what they had expected before. And hence, I think when Yao Yang talked about democratization, a topic that the government has embraced. The government is at least talking the talk, although not yet walking the talk. But that is largely because it realized this is what the people want. So the big challenge is whether the Communist Party of China could do what the Kuomintang has done, or it would end up with a fate similar to that of General Suharto in Indonesia. So what is the secret for making a government more accountable? And hence, that is something that the well-known recipe is free elections, a free press, and an independent judiciary. And I think these are areas that the talk of a harmonious society is really about. This is a very difficult area to move on, largely because it requires a change in the character of the state. The final kind of failure, I think, is the one that is most difficult for China to deal with. That is power supply failure, of which we can see two types. One is simply running out of power, like running out of water, or the air is so poisonous that it affects the health of the people. Then the second type of failure is the failure that comes from foreigners stopping the economic growth of China, specifically through trade sanctions. And trade sanctions could occur on fronts to do with disagreement over the trade imbalances and with China's role in global emission of CO2. This is, I think, the greatest area that the Chinese government has difficulties in dealing with, power supply failure. Number one, it has to display much higher level of diplomatic sophistication than it has displayed so far. The absence of Wen Jiabao from the final session of the Copenhagen summit is certainly reveals such a misunderstanding about China's role in the world and of what people expect China's contribution to be. And if you look at China's interaction with the United States, clearly the US and Australian interaction with China occurs on many fronts, and reaction by the US on any single issue depends on what it sees to be Chinese progress on other problems. Specifically, China has so far has not done much on reducing trade imbalances, specifically in response to the US demand that it appreciates its exchange rate. China has not helped sufficiently yet on the North Korean issue. China has not yet helped sufficiently on the Iranian nuclear issue. So on a whole host of fronts, China, I think, has to be internationally more conscious about what its role ought to be. And in order for China to come to a clear formulation of what its role in the world to be, it has to think more deeply about the changes that has occurred within China and how it is impacting on the rest of the world. So to end, on the three types of failures that I see, I think hardware failure is something that the Chinese government will handle quite very well. Software failure, I think it recognizes what they are and have been taking steps to address them, like, for example, increasing the amount of internal party democracy. But on the third area, I think is the area where China has shown least progress. The third area being China's adeptness in dealing with the rest of the world, not only on things like trade imbalances, but in scientific cooperation to solve common climatic problems. So I therefore think that while we do want to think about a positive outcome in the next 20 years, however, that would require actions both in China and abroad, to bring that about. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Wing, leaving us with some challenging thoughts to take into the discussion. We were a bit late getting started. I suggest we need some time for discussion, so I suggest we go on to 11:10, put back the morning tea by that 10 minutes, and I'll leave it to the chair of the next session, Wing Tai Wu, to either absorb that 10 minutes or extend it into the lunchtime. Who would like to open with question or comment, please? Microphones being brought around, and if you can say where you're from, who you are.
I'm Ian Chong, National University of Singapore. And my question really goes to Professors Yang and Zhang, who I think have laid out a very radical idea about democratization and how that could perhaps reduce the role of special interests in the Chinese economy. The reason I raise this is because if we look at some of the more mature democracies around us, the United States, with its automobile, energy, HMO, healthcare industry, well, special interests seem quite powerful even in these mature democratic societies. If we look at Japan, if we look at Europe, the agriculture industry, among others. I'm sure this never happens in Australia, but it just occurs to me that in mature democratic societies, it's difficult to get rid of special interests. And so I'm wondering what your preliminary roadmap is for sort of reducing the role of special interests in China based on a movement towards a more democratic direction. Thank you.
I think that's a terrific question. And you addressed it to Yang, but I'm going to ask Yongsheng as well to have a shot at the answer. Yeah.
Just for use this. Well, that's a good question. Well, in China, it's not just a special interest group, but also the government. I mean, especially local governments, if you look at their behaviors, they're pretty much like corporations. If you say the public sector as the chairman of the board, then the mayor as the general manager, they agree. Right? So the governments are becoming interest groups in their own. In this case, it's not just to use popular participation, democratization as a way to counterbalance special interest groups, but also a way to balance the economy. Right? If you can revere people's preference, then I think the magnetic train line is not going to be built between Shanghai and Hangzhou. So it's not just about politics. It's, to me, especially in the short run, it's more about adjusting the economic structure.
I just mentioned the vertical balance between the different levels of governments. Another important point I would like to stress is the horizontal balance. This is the check and balance of the government. So the government can be limited and to control, to reduce its opportunistic behavior in a market, so the market can function well. As for a special interest, I think there are two sources so far in China. One is the state-owned enterprises, because they are very influential, and Professor Yao mentioned the disinterested government. And actually, the government is hijacked by the SOEs because they are so powerful. And second source is the government is not well check and balanced. The government is too powerful, so the opportunistic behavior in the market. And for how to prevent special interest to influence the policy, I think. Yeah. The public participation in the policy making process is very important. A couple of years ago, we particularly studied the public inquiry in Australia in the Productivity Commission. So I think it's a very good example. China may learn something from it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'd like to endorse the concluding point there that a greater role of transparency, independent analysis in policy making, very important in this issue in China and in Australia. Who'd like to continue with questions or comments? Please.
I'm the student of Professor Ligang just at Crawford School. My question is for Professor Andrew. You mentioned that the social security system is very important, but I'd like to ask you, whether do you think that the funding source of social security is also very important? I think currently China's government should change the state-owned asset into the social security system. Currently, the normal people have nothing to do with the state-owned asset. If the state-owned asset can be changed into the social security system, the normal people will enjoy from them. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. There are two sorts of sources. One is sort of fiscal, and the other is contributory. And I think in building social security systems, you need both, particularly with an aging population. Currently, the Chinese system has a very limited amount of fiscal input, and it's quite clear that that needs to increase. The broad model of a three-pillar system, a fiscal pension, a contributory system, a compulsory contributory system, and then a voluntary contributory system is becoming very widely accepted, and it's part of the Chinese approach, but the fiscal input is very limited. And I think in a period of high growth, when you can't tell what the future is going to be like, inflation, wage rises, you do need to have an ultimate fiscal backup. The source of that funding in the fiscal system, of course, is not an easy issue, and therefore that's why it's so important for the government to start thinking about it now. I think with the housing reform in the 1990s, the Chinese government missed a chance. That if the public housing had been privatized in a way that enabled them to bring those funds into the social security system, it would have been important. Certainly, I think issues to do with how you get those fiscal resources are going to be a big challenge. I don't know if I've got the answer.
Tao Kung.
Sherry Tao Kung from Research School of Economics. Well, my question is for Dr. Yongsheng, and I liked your presentation very much. I would like to invite you to say a little bit more about the fiscal reform in China, particularly in the context of central government relationship. I see this as at a very direct level. This is certainly about resource allocation. And how do we improve the efficiency in the productive factor allocation in the market as well as in other sectors? But at a more fundamental level, this is more about aligning the different incentives for different interest groups, government sectors included, and also at a very deep level, this is also related to the political institutional reform agenda in China, and that has certainly long-term implications to the sustainability of the economic development in China. And I think that these points also related to other speakers on this panel. It related to how rural-urban integration can happen in a more manageable way and more smooth way, and related to regional inequality, as what Jen has mentioned, and the accountability or transparency in the government in the government sector, as what Yaoyang has mentioned. And Andrew's point of social security reform is also very much hinge on the fiscal side of the whole system. And I guess for Wing, the way forward to address the external to manage and also to address the external expectations, it has much to do with how we can obtain an inner peace, which means how we can deal with the domestic issues, both on the economic as well as the political front. And that's probably well-equipped China with better strength and better capability to deal with the external expectations. Thanks.
The central question was to Yongsheng, so I'll ask him to respond.
Before 1994, the central government only controls very minor fiscal resources of the country. So many people argue that the central government's fiscal capability was too weak to realize the so-called state will and push for the national agenda on reform and development. So in 1994, the central government introduced the tax sharing system and substantially changed the fiscal relationship between central local relationship. Now the central government control most fiscal resources of the nation. The problem for this change is that the transfer payments have not been very institutionalized. It's a little bit flexible, and especially the central government department are very powerful. They make decisions on the allocation of the fiscal resources is really to further institutionalize the allocation of the transfer payments. At the provincial, local level, now the local governments have huge fiscal difficulties. That's because the provincial government is too strong. They not only controls the fiscal resources, but also controls the appointment of the local governments. The local government has no power, no bargaining power. They cannot say no to the higher level government. So we need to introduce the tax sharing system and formalize the transfer payments at the provincial and local level. And also we need to establish a check and balance mechanism to the government so that the two types of opportunistic behavior cannot be reinforced. So that's what I want to say.
Right. Thanks. There are quite a few people wanting to ask questions, but to keep us within reasonable prospects of staying on time later in the day, I think I'll have to close it off there. Thanks very much to the panel for raising such important questions.